May 2nd, 1972. Just after 8 o'clock in the morning, 3030th Place Northwest, Washington, D.C. J. Edgar Hoover was found dead on the floor of his bedroom, near the bed, in a home he had lived in alone for 34 years. He was 77 years old. He had been director of the FBI for 48 years, 8 presidents, 16 attorneys general, and not one of them had ever been able to fire him. The official cause was heart disease. But within hours of his death, something else was already happening across town. In his outer office at FBI headquarters, his personal secretary, Helen Gandy, was already at work. She wasn't grieving. She was shredding. Cabinets full of files, documents nobody outside that office had ever seen. Names, dates, photographs, wiretap logs. Secrets that could burn Washington to the ground. She worked for weeks. By the time she was finished, the most dangerous filing cabinet in America was empty. This wasn't just a bureaucrat. This was the man who built the modern surveillance state. Hoover controlled the FBI like a private empire. He knew who slept with whom in the Senate. He knew which cabinet secretary drank too much. He knew what Martin Luther King said behind closed hotel doors. He kept files on Eleanor Roosevelt, on Marilyn Monroe, on Frank Sinatra, on John Kennedy, on Richard Nixon, and he made sure every man who ever walked into the Oval Office understood one thing clearly. The director stayed, no matter who won the election. This is the story of how a shy kid from Seward Square in Washington, D.C., turned himself into the most feared, unelected man in American history. How he weaponized federal law enforcement, hunted radicals, hunted gangsters, hunted civil rights leaders, and quietly built a paper empire of blackmail that outlived him. This is the true story behind the 2011 film J. Edgar. The parts Hollywood softened, and the parts that were far darker than any movie dared to show. But here's what you have to understand before we go any further. Hoover didn't seize power. Presidents gave it to him, every single one. And the reason why is a story that starts with a bomb. June 2nd, 1919, just after 11 at night, a man walked up to the front steps of a townhouse on R Street in Washington, D.C. That house belonged to Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. The man carried a suitcase full of dynamite. He tripped. The bomb went off early. It blew him apart on the sidewalk and shattered every window on the block. Across the street, a young assistant secretary of the Navy named Franklin Roosevelt heard the blast from his front porch. More bombs went off that same night in 7 other cities across the country. Judges, politicians, a Catholic church. It was coordinated. It was terror, and America panicked. Palmer needed a response, fast. He turned to a young Justice Department lawyer, a 24-year-old bureaucrat with a bulldog jaw and a photographic memory. His name was John Edgar Hoover. Hoover had been born January 1st, 1895, in a modest Protestant neighborhood 3 blocks behind the U.S. Capitol. He had a stutter as a boy. He fixed it by teaching himself to talk fast, very fast. He worked as a messenger at the Library of Congress and mastered the library's cataloging system inside and out. That's important. Because Hoover looked at people the way a librarian looks at books. Everyone had a card. Everyone had a category. Everyone could be filed. Palmer put Hoover in charge of the new radical division. Hoover was given one job: find the anarchists, find the communists, find the immigrants who threaten America, and get rid of them. What followed became known as the Palmer Raids. November 7th, 1919. Then again on January 2nd, 1920, federal agents kicked down doors in more than 30 cities. They arrested thousands of people, with estimates running from 3,000 to as many as 10,000 across the 2 sweeps. Most had no warrants issued against them. Most had committed no crime. Many were held in filthy rooms without lawyers, without food, without any contact with families for days. Hoover personally compiled a card index of 450,000 suspected radicals, 450,000 names, hand-typed, cross-referenced, in under 2 years. He was 25 years old. Around 556 people were eventually deported. Most of the rest were released quietly when a young Assistant Secretary of Labor named Louis Post reviewed the cases and found them legally worthless. The raids collapsed in scandal. Palmer's career was finished. But Hoover, the man who ran the operation, took none of the blame. He testified before Congress with icy composure. He blamed the excesses on others. He walked out of the wreckage of the Palmer raids more powerful than he went in. And he had learned the lesson that would define the rest of his life. Fear was a weapon, and whoever controlled the files controlled the fear. 4 years later, on May 10, 1924, Attorney General Harlan Fiske Stone called Hoover into his office. The old Bureau of Investigation was a mess. Corrupt agents, political appointees, bribes, scandal. Stone needed a cleanup man. He offered the job to Hoover. Hoover accepted on the spot, but with conditions. No political hires. Promotions based on merit, and the director answered only to the Attorney General, no one else. Stone agreed. Hoover was 29 years old. He would not leave that office alive. Now here's where it gets interesting. Because the first thing Hoover did as director wasn't chase criminals. It was build an image. He shrank the Bureau. He fired the deadwood. He instituted strict dress codes, weight requirements, personal conduct rules. Agents had to be white, male, college-educated, preferably lawyers or accountants. They wore dark suits and white shirts. They did not drink on duty. They did not have facial hair. They kept their hair short and their reports shorter. Hoover was building a brand, not a police force, a brand. But by the early 1930s, America was drowning in a different kind of chaos. The Great Depression had created a new class of celebrity criminal, John Dillinger, robbing banks and jumping bail. Babyface Nelson, who killed 3 FBI agents, more than any other man in Bureau history. Pretty Boy Floyd, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, Ma Barker and her sons, Machine Gun Kelly. They were folk heroes in some places. Farmers cheered when banks got hit. Newspapers made them into legends. And in the middle of this, on March 1st, 1932, the 20-month-old son of Charles Lindbergh, the most famous man in America, was taken from his crib in Hopewell, New Jersey. A ladder against the wall, a ransom note, $50,000 demanded. The child was found dead 10 weeks later, 4.5 miles from the house. Hoover saw his opportunity. The Lindbergh case was not originally an FBI matter. Kidnapping wasn't a federal crime yet. But Hoover pushed. He lobbied Congress. And in June 1932, the Federal Kidnapping Act, the so-called Lindbergh Law, made abduction across state lines a federal crime. The FBI's jurisdiction exploded overnight. By 1934, after Bonnie and Clyde and a string of bank robberies pushed public panic even higher, Congress passed a package of laws that made bank robbery federal, made assaulting a federal agent federal, made fleeing across state lines to avoid prosecution federal. Hoover got everything he asked for, and he asked for a lot. Then came Dillinger, July 22, 1934. The Biograph Theater in Chicago. A woman in an orange skirt walked out with him. Federal agents were waiting. 20 seconds later, John Dillinger was face down in the alley next to the theater, 3 bullets in him. The agent who led the ambush, Melvin Purvis, became a national hero, which was a problem, because Hoover did not tolerate rivals, not inside the Bureau, not ever. Within a year, Purvis was pushed out. His career was quietly destroyed. He would eventually die of a gunshot to the head in 1960. Officially ruled a suicide, though his family always insisted it was an accident. Hoover, meanwhile, took the credit. Newspapers, radio programs, movies, comic books, G-men became icons, and J. Edgar Hoover became the face of American law enforcement. Untouchable, national, permanent. But here's what the history books soften. While Hoover was hunting John Dillinger with machine guns and headlines, he refused to acknowledge that a much larger, much more organized criminal enterprise even existed. The Mafia, La Cosa Nostra. For decades, Hoover publicly denied there was any such thing as a national crime syndicate. Local police forces knew better. The Bureau of Narcotics knew better. Journalists knew better. Hoover said no. It didn't exist. There was no national syndicate, just isolated hoodlums, and nobody could figure out why. Some historians think he was afraid that going after the Mafia would corrupt his agents, the way Prohibition had corrupted local cops. Others think it was worse than that. Others think the Mafia had something on him. Specifically, that certain New York bosses knew things about Hoover's private life that he could not afford to have surface. What we know for certain is this. On November 14th, 1957, a New York state trooper stumbled on a gathering at the country estate of Joseph Barbara in Appalachian, New York. More than 60 Mafia bosses from across America were meeting there in secret. Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, Santo Trafficante. When police showed up, men in silk suits ran through the woods in dress shoes. The Appalachian meeting exposed the Mafia to the world overnight. Hoover, for the first time in 30 years, could no longer deny it existed. He quietly ordered the FBI to create a top hoodlum program. He never publicly admitted he had been wrong. He simply pivoted and started claiming credit for a fight he had refused to enter. Now let's talk about the man himself, because this is where the film J. Edgar tried, and mostly failed, to tell the truth. Hoover lived with his mother, Annie Marie, in the same modest house on Seward Square for the first 43 years of his life. He never married. He never had a documented romantic relationship with a woman. When his mother died in 1938, Hoover was devastated. By then, one man had already become the center of his private world. Clyde Tolson, a young agent hired in 1928, had risen in just 3 years to become Hoover's second-in-command, eventually holding the formal title of Associate Director. Tolson would remain his closest companion for more than 4 decades. They ate breakfast together most mornings. They ate lunch together nearly every day. They ate dinner together most evenings. At Harvey's restaurant on Connecticut Avenue, same table, same waiters. They vacationed together. Miami, La Jolla, the horse races at Del March. They were photographed together on beaches, at nightclubs, at track meets. In FBI headquarters, staff quietly called them J. Edna and Mother Tolson. Whether they were physically lovers has been debated for 50 years. What is documented is this. When Hoover died in 1972, he left the bulk of his estate to Clyde Tolson. Tolson inherited the house, the money, and the flag from Hoover's coffin. Tolson moved into that house. He would die 3 years later, in 1975. He was buried a few yards from Hoover in Congressional Cemetery in Washington. That's not speculation. That's the record. Now, understand what this meant. Hoover was, by any reasonable reading, likely a gay man running the most powerful investigative agency in the country during a period when the federal government was firing gay employees by the thousands under Executive Order 10,450. He personally supervised what became known as the Sex Deviates Program, a special FBI operation that collected files on suspected homosexuals in government service. From 1951 until the mid-1970s, that program compiled roughly 330,000 pages of material, quietly destroyed by the Bureau in 1977 and 78. Careers destroyed, families broken, suicides that never made the papers. And the man running the machine had every reason to fear being on his own list. That, more than anything, explains the files. Because the real weapon Hoover built wasn't the FBI crime laboratory, opened in 1932. It wasn't the fingerprint division, which by 1946 held over 100 million fingerprint cards. It wasn't the 10 most wanted list, launched in 1950. His real weapon was information, and more specifically, information he wasn't supposed to have. Officially, the FBI kept case files. Officially, everything was documented, indexed, and available to the Attorney General. Unofficially, Hoover kept a second system. It was called the Official and Confidential Files, kept in his personal office suite. Access limited to Hoover, Tolson, and Helen Gandy, his secretary of 54 years. These files contained material Hoover collected on politicians, celebrities, judges, journalists, and civil rights leaders, extramarital affairs, drinking problems, financial troubles, sexual preferences, anything that could be used as leverage. Franklin Roosevelt used the files to spy on his political enemies. Harry Truman despised Hoover but couldn't remove him. Dwight Eisenhower kept his distance. John Kennedy tried to control him and failed. Lyndon Johnson embraced him and quoted the famous line about it being better to have Hoover inside the tent than outside it. Richard Nixon was terrified of him. In 1971, on a White House tape, Nixon can be heard admitting that he wanted to fire Hoover but couldn't figure out how to do it safely. Consider what Hoover knew about the Kennedys alone. On March 22, 1962, Hoover had lunch with President John Kennedy at the White House. That lunch is documented in his personal calendar. What was discussed in the room isn't. But the FBI had already opened a file on a woman named Judith Campbell Exner. Campbell was simultaneously involved with President Kennedy and with Sam Giancana, the boss of the Chicago outfit. FBI wiretaps in Chicago had captured Giancana talking about the connection. Hoover had the evidence. He handled it delicately, and soon after that White House lunch, phone logs show, the Kennedy affair with Judith Campbell was quietly ended. Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General and Hoover's direct boss, hated Hoover. He tried to force him to focus on organized crime. Hoover slow-walked every request. And when President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas on November 22, 1963, Hoover controlled the investigation absolutely. He shaped what the Warren Commission would see and what it would not see. For half a century afterward, thousands of pages of FBI material from that period remained sealed or heavily redacted. But if there is one operation that reveals who Hoover really was, it wasn't gangsters, it wasn't communists, it wasn't presidents, it was Martin Luther King, Jr. Hoover opened a full FBI file on Dr. King in 1962. He was convinced, without meaningful evidence, that King was being manipulated by communist advisors. In October 1963, Attorney General Robert Kennedy authorized FBI wiretaps on King's phones. Hoover took that authorization and went far beyond it. Under a program called COINTELPRO, which had been formally launched in 1956, the FBI planted bugs in King's hotel rooms. They recorded his private moments. They compiled tapes of what agents claimed were sexual encounters. Then, in November 1964, weeks before King was scheduled to receive the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo, Norway, an unmarked package arrived at King's Circle through the offices of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in Atlanta. Inside was a spool of audio tape and a letter typed anonymously, addressed to King. The letter called King a fraud. It called him a moral degenerate. It told him there was only one thing left for him to do, that he knew what it was, and it gave him exactly 34 days to do it. It was urging him unmistakably to kill himself. That letter, historians and congressional investigators have since concluded, was drafted inside FBI headquarters by senior officials, almost certainly with Hoover's knowledge. The federal government of the United States, through its highest law enforcement agency, attempted to blackmail an American Nobel Peace Prize laureate into suicide. COINTELPRO didn't stop with King. It targeted the Black Panther Party. It targeted the American Indian movement. It targeted the anti-war movement. It targeted the Socialist Workers' Party. It targeted the Puerto Rican independence movement. Agents forged letters, planted informants, broke up marriages, spread rumors that got activists killed by their own comrades. On December 4th, 1969, Chicago Panther leader Fred Hampton was shot to death in his bed by police in a raid coordinated with FBI intelligence supplied by an informant Hoover's agents had planted inside the Panthers. Hampton was 21 years old. He was asleep next to his pregnant fiancée. He never woke up. By the early 1970s, the machine Hoover had built was starting to leak. On March 8, 1971, A group calling itself the Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI broke into a small FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania. They stole roughly 1,000 documents. They mailed them to newspapers, and for the first time the American public saw the words COINTELPRO in print. The exposures kept coming. Congressional investigations were forming. The Nixon White House had drafted its own illegal domestic spying scheme, the Houston Plan, which Hoover himself had blocked, not out of principle, but because he refused to share his turf. And Hoover, at 77, was showing his age. He ate his last dinner with Clyde Tolson on the night of May 1st, 1972, just as they had done, together, for over 40 years. He went home to 3030th Place Northwest. He read for a while. He went to bed. His housekeeper, Annie Fields, found him the next morning on the bedroom floor. Dr. Robert Schweitzer certified the cause as hypertensive cardiovascular disease. He was pronounced dead on the morning of May 2nd, 1972. His body lay in state in the rotunda of the United States Capitol. He was only the 22nd American in history to receive that honor. The President of the United States, Richard Nixon, delivered the eulogy at his funeral. Nixon called him a giant. Privately, on the White House tapes, Nixon's words for Hoover had been far less reverent. Words of frustration, words of fear, because everyone in that room at the Capitol understood the same thing. The files. Where were the files? Who had the files now? The answer was already unfolding. Helen Gandy had begun destroying Hoover's personal papers within hours of his death. She was 75 years old. She had worked for him since 1918. She was more loyal to Hoover than she was to the Bureau, the government, or the law. She sat in his office, and she fed documents into destruction bins for weeks. She testified later, under oath, that she destroyed only Hoover's purely personal correspondence. She said the official files went to Tolson, and then to the Bureau. What was actually in those personal files, and how much material simply disappeared, no one will ever know. Congressional investigators found her testimony unconvincing, but there was no way to prove what had been in a file that no longer existed. Clyde Tolson left the FBI within days of Hoover's funeral. He inherited the house, the estate, and the memory. He lived quietly, in failing health, for 3 more years. He died on April 14th, 1975. He was buried near Hoover. The FBI Hoover left behind was transformed within a decade. Congressional hearings in 1975, led by Senator Frank Church of Idaho, exposed the extent of COINTELPRO, the domestic spying, the blackmail, the illegal break-ins that the Bureau had been running for decades. The Church Committee's final report, delivered in 1976, forced the creation of new oversight. FBI directors were now limited to a single 10-year term. Congressional intelligence committees were created. The rules changed. But the files, the ones that survived, are still there. Some remain classified to this day. Some have been released only in redacted form. Some, we know from context, discussed people whose reputations still stand only because Hoover chose, for reasons of his own, not to burn them down. That is the real story behind J. Edgar. The 2011 film shows a man haunted by his mother, tormented by love he could not admit, obsessed with control. That much is true. But the film softens the machine he built. It softens the raids of 1920. It softens the smearing of Martin Luther King. It softens the deaths inside COINTELPRO. It softens the deal every American president made with him for nearly half a century. Because here is the final truth. J. Edgar Hoover did not steal his power. He was handed it by presidents who found him useful, by Congresses that funded him, by newspapers that made him a hero, by a country that wanted, more than anything, to feel safe and did not ask too many questions about who was watching. He filed us all. He kept the drawer locked. And on the morning of May 2nd, 1972, when that drawer finally opened, the woman standing next to it lit the match. That is how empires end. Not with a trial, Not with a confession. With a shredder, working quietly in an empty office while the eulogy was being written across town.